Alright, now that we've properly set up the steering on our car and that's all ready to go and ready to hit the racetrack, what we're going to do is we're now going to set up our throttle linkage. Once we've built the linkage assembly and got everything threaded on, our collets are in place, the next thing to do is get it onto the servo as well. So again, you want your throttle trims at 0, and what we're going to do is, again, you're going to try to find the closest location to center on the spline, but a lot of times, again, that's not going to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to get as close as we can. Then we're going to install the servo horn. Alright, and same thing with the steering. Once that's on, now you want to get this horn straight in a straight line with the servo itself. So we're going to use our sub trim feature again in our radio to do that with. Alright, now that I've got the angle pretty much about as close to linear as we can, what we're now going to do is focus on getting the endpoint adjustment on the throttle side and the endpoint adjustment on our brake side set correctly. What you want to happen when you're setting the EPA on the throttle, much like the steering, is you don't want the servo to try to open too far and cause premature wear. So when you go to full throttle, what you want to do is you want to make sure that your carburetor barrel is as far open as it can be without trying to overextend the carburetor. Alright, so when I pull full throttle, one thing I like to do is pull on this linkage, and I like to have just a little bit of back and forth play at the end of the carburetor. I don't like to max it out and have it all the way maxed out with my EPA, because as the chassis is flexing front to back, if it's already as far as it'll go, you don't want to stress the servo by it over pulling on its maximum throw at the carburetor. Alright, the next thing to make sure that happens is when you come back to neutral on your radio, you're going to want to use your spring here that's between the collet and the servo horn to make sure that the carburetor comes back to its idle position when the car comes back to neutral. And you're going to do that with the tension on this spring and the location of this collet. So if we were to start from scratch, what we would want to do is remove this collet. Alright, and with the servo at neutral position, what I like to do is push against the end of my linkage and make sure that I can't further close the carburetor anymore. That makes sure that you're at idle setting when you're off the trigger. Alright, if you were to have the carburetor slightly open at your neutral position, that's going to cause the car to run on and incorrectly tune your motor because of that condition. So when I put the collet back on, I'll apply pressure to the end of the linkage to make sure that the carburetor stays closed at the neutral position. And then when I reset my collet, I try to leave maybe about a 5 thousandths to 10 thousandths gap between the servo horn piece right here that swivels and the actual blue collet. And what that does is it just makes sure that with any slight fluctuations and oscillations of the servo, that if it's doing any of that, it's not actually opening the carburetor at the same time that it's oscillating. Plus also that gives you just a little bit of forgiveness and a little bit of a deadband on your throttle finger. So if you're accidentally kind of barely giving throttle, or for drivers that may not be so smooth on their throttle finger, it just gives you a little bit of forgiveness in there on the throttle side of things. Now as far as the brakes go, one thing we're going to look at on correctly setting the brakes is when you're setting the brake disc inside of the brake pads here, one thing people do and make the mistake of is actually setting the gap too large between the pads and the actual disc itself. So what I like to do when I'm setting this is I'll close the pad onto the disc, alright, and get it tight by hand till there was no play. And then what I'll do is usually take my wrench and then back these off about 3/4 of a turn on each side. And what that does is it allows the disc to float freely inside of the pads, alright, to where you're not causing any type of drag brake conditioning, you're not binding up the drivetrain, but yet decreasing the gap right here will make your brakes feel more instantaneous, and it'll make your brakes feel more precise when you're trying to only give 25 to 50% brake and you're not actually going full stroke on the brake on your radio. If you have too much gap between the pads and the disc, what will actually happen is you start getting side-to-side movement between the pads and the disc, and this can cause the inside of the disc to wear out faster, but it will also make you have to go further on your radio, further into the throw on the brake side of the servo before the brakes will actually engage and start to stop the car. This is kind of referred to as feeling like you have too much air inside the brake system on a real car that has fluid hydraulic brakes. The last thing you want to do in a full-scale race car is hit the brakes, then you hit an air pocket, you don't get any feeling from the driver's seat, so therefore you have to go further into the brake pedal before the fluid actually gets to the pistons and the calipers in a real race car. The same thing will happen if you've got too much gap right here at your brake disc and your brake pads. So now as we come back to the car, now that we've got the pads and the disc set correctly, is to make sure that we don't have too much play right here in our brake levers. All right, getting the linkages set right here on your throttle and brake side can actually make all the world difference in how your car drives. It'll make your motor tune feel better. It'll just give you all around more consistency when trying to downside jumps and not overrun your corners, knowing that your brakes are going to do exactly what you want them to do. If these collets are too far back to where there's a lot of play right here on these levers, then the same thing's going to happen if you have too much gap between your discs and your pads. Is when you start to give the car a brake, nothing's actually going to happen. So as I'm rolling the drivetrain, I've only started to barely give it any brake, but already my drivetrain wants to start slowing down. Alright, so therefore when I go full throw on my brakes, I've got a lot of brakes. And when I'm at neutral, I have no brakes. Alright, the last thing you want is to be at full throw, but still be able to turn your drivetrain over. That means your brakes are set up incorrectly. Alright, now that the brakes have been properly set up and are mechanically correct, the next option that you have to getting the performance and the feel of the car the way you want it to be is within the brake bias. There's no proper setting for brake bias. It's all driver feel for the most part. But real quick, in a nutshell, a 50-50 brake bias is going to drive very neutral, feeling like it's not have a tendency to slide out on the rear or to push the nose. Some drivers may like a car to where when they go in the corner and hit the brake, when they hit the brake, they want it to slide out on the rear to try to initiate the corner. If that's the case, you're going to want to run a setting on your rear brakes to where you thread this in farther than the front to run what's called more rear brake bias. If you're the kind of driver who when you go into the corner, you want the front to feel real stable, it'll get on the nose but not slide out, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to run more front brake bias. And you'll do that by threading in the collet here further into the servo horn, and that's going to create a feel of having more of a front end push but a more stable and more consistent feeling on the racetrack. For me personally, typically I like to run probably what I would call a 40% front, 60% rear brake bias. And that obviously changes per track and per condition, but for most drivers just starting out or trying to kind of learn and get their feet under them, I would start around 50 to 50 brake bias or 40 front, 60% rear brake bias.